Hello and welcome everybody to the RISE webinar on To Get Children Learning, More Money is Necessary but Not Sufficient. I will now hand over to Mary Goretti.
Thank you very much, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. So my name is Mary Goretti Nakabko, Executive Director of Uwezo Uganda. Uwezo Uganda specializes in tracking learning outcomes and using the evidence to drive a focus on delivering improved learning outcomes for all children in East Africa. In doing this, we are part of the People's Action for Learning Network, PAL Network, the Regional Education Learning Network, READY, and the Research on Improving Systems of Education, RISE Community of Practice, which brings together practitioners to share learning on solving the learning crisis. It's my great honor to warmly welcome you to this side event of the Global Education Summit, which in 5 days' time, the UK and Kenya will co-host, try and raise $5 billion to ensure that all children in developing countries have access to quality education. The theme of this event, as you have already seen it, is to get children learning. More money is necessary, but not sufficient. Before we go into the details of this theme, let me ask Sam to share a couple of slides with me here. Sam, please share. So that's the theme of our webinar today. So control here. Sam, I'm not able to control the slides from here. Yeah, okay. So before we go into the details of the seminar, please have a look at your screen and look at the picture that is on the screen. What do you think is going on here? Look at the type of the tire on your car, on the screen. You can write down one word somewhere, a phrase or a sentence. So those of you who drive cars, perhaps you have come across a concept called wheel alignment. The purpose of wheel alignment is to ensure that the car travels straight in one direction, meaning that if the car wheels are misaligned, the car will either pull to the left or to the right. And once it does that, it causes the tires to wear very, very quickly and makes driving quite unsafe. So that also means if the tires of the car wears very fast, as we saw on the screen, so if you see that part that has worn out, if it wears out very quickly, maybe tires which would have lasted for a year or so, you'll have to replace them in a couple of months, maybe 3 or 4 months. So it means you're wasting resources. Bringing back to this webinar, this webinar explores how alignments or misalignments in the education systems affect the effectiveness of investment in education. So the concept that you will hear very, very frequently in this webinar will be either alignment or misalignment. And you have seen the dangers of misalignment. It causes damage, but it also wastes resources. So in the context of our education system, in the past couple of decades, many countries have struggled to translate schooling into learning. And for them to address the learning crisis, they have actually put more resources, inputs, and finances in trying to promote increased access. But research shows actually that if you put more resources and inputs in a system that is not aligned to drive learning, it actually does not cause learning. You end up wasting resources because the system in the first place is not aligned to cause learning. So in this event, as you will hear from the different panelists, we explore ways of making an education system better aligned for learning so that it is suitable for our children. So if we try to align the system, that will pave the way to ensure that the investments that we put in actually cause learning. So as we said, we love more money because we need more money to drive learning. But we are saying money on the table is not enough unless all the other systems are actually also aligned to ensure that learning takes place. So how do we then ensure that our education system is aligned to deliver learning for all children? So in the run up to the Education Summit, Global Education Summit that we talked about, that the UK government and Kenya is hosting in the next 5 days, we have written a letter addressed to Prime Minister Johnson and President Kenyatta. And that letter has been written by a group of practitioners who are they're really at the forefront of the learning crisis. And from experience, we have drawn 5 lessons that, if attended to, they can actually deliver learning for all children. The first point here that we raise in the letter, which will also be published in the next few days, next week. First of all, we need to acknowledge that there is a learning crisis and that solving the learning crisis is very critical to jumpstart the recovery. So we need to act now. Those of you who have been following the education debate, even before the pandemic, learning outcomes were very low for millions of children. For example, in developing countries, 90% of 10-year-olds had not yet learned how to read with understanding, even before the pandemic. Even in middle-income countries like South Africa, about 78% of children could not read with understanding after going through 3 years of primary education. So that means there's a learning crisis which is likely to even worsen with a pandemic, and we need to act now. Number 2 is that it cannot be business as usual. As you saw, that if we align our system to just deliver access or inputs, however much money we put into the system, it may not lead to learning. So we need to ensure that the replenishment of the GPE funds that we are all advocating for, that the funds are used actually to drive strategies or interventions that are going to improve learning. And some of these strategies, which is number 3, in countries where even children were struggling to read or do basic arithmetic, we need to focus first on foundational skills. Because as you know, we talked about the 90% who were not even learning before the pandemic. So what we need to do now is to ensure that we drive catch-up programs to ensure that these children are learning. Because acquiring foundational skills ensures that they also acquire the higher order skills. They need these skills to actually attempt higher order and higher learning, and for them to be able to thrive in the world. Number 4 is that we need to build partnerships to overcome the learning crisis. So as world leaders convene in Kenya, in the UK, partnering with Kenya, and political leaders, they need to know that it takes a village. In Africa, we say it takes a village to educate a child. So we need to draw from the expertise of civil society organizations, academics, researchers, and practitioners to ensure that we are all focused in one direction of addressing the learning crisis. Lastly is that for us to treat the root, we should be treating the root causes rather than being tempted by shiny silver bullets. So the root causes here is that in most cases, the education system is actually very complex. But quite often, like we said, the systems they are in are not really aligned to deliver learning outcomes. So we need to ensure that all systems are actually aligned, and that we are focusing, all of us are focusing on learning rather than on access or inputs to ensure that the system delivers learning for all children. So that is enough from me. Today we have a panel of 5 people, very experienced panelists who are going to share their experiences and evidence, research evidence on how the system can actually be aligned. So you can remove the slides, Sam. So we have a group, a panel of 5 panelists who are going to take us through the ways in which we can make an education system better aligned for learning. And I take now this opportunity to introduce Mala. Mala, are you there?
Hello.
Mala Spivak is a research manager of RISE and a research fellow on the Building State Capability Program at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. Mala is going to present the RISE Education Systems Diagnostic, a tool which is used to identify high-level misalignments that are present in an education system and preventing progress on learning. You're most welcome, Mala, to present the tool.
Thank you so much, Garetti. I'm really excited to be here today. Sam, could I have the slides, please? While Sam is getting the slides ready, I will get started so we don't waste time. So Garetti, in your opening remarks, you were really emphasizing the importance of alignment in education systems. And as you were saying, for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about a framework we've been developing at the RISE program for understanding education systems. And this framework focuses on seeing the system as a set of relationships that can be aligned for different purposes. The framework helps us understand why these relationships produce the outcomes that we see and identify some of the incoherences in the system that can undermine efforts at reform. And also, as Garetti mentioned, this is both an analytical tool that a lot of RISE research is anchored around, and I think you'll see the connections between the framework and some of the research that the other panelists are going to present. And it's also a practical diagnostic tool that we've been piloting in a number of different countries. So I'm going to see if I can take control. Can I take control of the slides? Yeah, great. So why do we need a systems framework? How is a systems approach useful? What it can be really useful for is understanding any complex problem that results from interactions or feedback loops, whether that's an education system or the economy or the human body. And we need a systems approach because often when we face a serious problem, it's tempting to jump in with solutions to the symptoms of the problem, often those silver bullets that Garetti was talking about, and try to treat the symptoms without having a diagnosis of the underlying causes. So if a person has a fever and aches, we could try to relieve each of those symptoms one by one, but that probably wouldn't cure them. And in fact, it might make the situation worse. And without a diagnosis, we can't choose the right treatment. We also see this as a persistent problem in education systems. It's tempting to spend our time and resources on treatments to the many visible symptoms of the learning crisis. And often this leads to well-designed and well-executed programs that fail to deliver learning, not because of any flaw in the program design per se, but because they were treating symptoms of the learning crisis, not the underlying cause. So for example, a textbook intervention in Kenya from the mid-2000s failed because the books, which were actually the books mandated by the curriculum, were too advanced for the average student in the classroom. The problem isn't that books don't help children learn how to read. The problem is that the curriculum itself was oriented toward the top performers. There's many similar examples, including of a failed management program in India that reinforced the process compliance orientation of the system rather than helping teachers focus on learning. So how can we better understand the system and plan for policy changes that can actually move the needle on learning? A systems framework can help in 2 ways. First, it shows how the outcomes are the results of interactions and feedback loops. And second, it shows the importance of alignment among the actors around a learning goal. So getting into the meat of the framework, It uses the paradigm of a principal-agent relationship to describe 4 key interactions in the system. Politics, which is the relationship between citizens and the highest authorities of the state. Compact, which is the relationship between the highest authorities of the state, the president, the legislature, the Ministry of Finance, and the education authorities, so the Ministry of Education and any other agencies like a curriculum board or an exams board that are responsible for education delivery. Management, which is a relationship between that Ministry of Education and other education authorities and the school leaders and the teachers at the front line actually teaching the children. And finally, voice and choice, which is the relationship between the community, parents and children, and the school leaders who are teaching them. And each of these relationships can be described by 5 design features. Delegation, which is what the principal asks the agent to do. Finance, which are the resources that the principal allocates to, for the agent to achieve their task. Support, which is the preparation and assistance that principals provide to the agents to complete their task. Information, which is how the principal assesses the agent's performance. And motivation, which is how the principal motivates the agent. Putting all of this together, we can describe the relationships between the actors in the system and how the features of each relationship affect the interactions and feedback loops among them. And the core conjecture of this framework is that the system produces learning when these relationships are aligned around learning goals. Once we look at the system in this way, there's 2 analytical exercises that we can do that can be helpful. First is we can identify what the relationships or features of the relationships are aligned to produce. And second, we can identify misalignments or incoherences, which are areas that should be prioritized for intervention or reform, focused on creating greater alignment for learning. So taking the first one, what are the relationships aligned to produce? Looking at each relationship and their features, we can identify what the relationship is oriented towards. So features can be oriented towards a learning goal. They can be oriented towards access and process compliance. They can be oriented towards socializing children into an ideology or perspective on the world. They can be oriented towards selection, choosing the top performers to advance on to more education, or they can be oriented towards clientelism, using the education system to give favors to important stakeholders. It's important to realize that these aren't mutually exclusive categories. Often relationships have components that are aligned to multiple different outcomes. Alignment for access is one of the most common alignments that we see across different education systems. And that's because expanding schooling is really politically popular. It's the kind of logistical task that's relatively easy for a bureaucracy to execute. And critically, it's consistent with the push to expand finance for education. More money can go straight into constructing more schools and hiring more teachers. Now, expansion of access for education is consistent with an education for all agenda if schooling actually produces learning. But unfortunately, what we see is that systems get oriented around expansion goals and learning gets left behind. So understanding these different alignments, we can look at the relationships and see what they are actually coherent for. So take the case of a management relationship. The Ministry of Education might delegate and support teachers to achieve a foundational literacy goal. But if the information collected by the system is concentrated on exams at the end of primary school that aren't really oriented around the curriculum and only focus on selecting which students will progress on to secondary, that pressures teachers to end up focusing on top performers and late grades to increase pass rates, rather than on supporting all of the children and putting resources in the early grades to reach that foundational reading goal. After looking within one relationship, we can look across the relationships and at the features across the relationship. So building on the same example, we could look at voice and choice in this same case. And what we might find is that parents and communities are also focused on the school leaving exams. And this is kind of a natural response to the fact that that's the only information that emerges in the system. So the delegation in the voice and choice relationship is coherent with information in the management relationship, but it's incoherent with the delegation in the management relationship. So you've got the 2 purple gears incoherent with the green gear. And this adds further pressure on teachers and school leaders to focus on teaching to the exam and on the late years rather than on foundational learning. So this is just a stylized example, of course, but you could progress through and do this analysis for all of the relationships and design elements, identifying areas where there's alignment to learning and surfacing areas where there's alignment for another purpose and where there are incoherences between different elements. And understanding these can point to areas where intervention would be most productive and where a program or policy change could bring greater alignment to learning. So that was a very quick introduction to the framework. I want to emphasize that this is meant to provide a scaffolding for understanding incoherence and how incoherence undermines outcomes. And I think the next 3 presentations that we're going to see are going to go a long way to providing some concrete examples where RISE research is surfacing examples of incoherences, and also where our research is pointing towards some of the principles for the types of changes and interventions that can actually create greater alignment for learning and deliver results for children. So I will hand it back to Goretti for the next presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marla. Thanks. Thank you. Really exemplified very, very well, and the usefulness of that tool to detect either alignment or misalignment within the system, and whether we ask ourselves, our system is really aligned to deliver learning or something else. So thanks a lot. So participants, colleagues, you can please now start using your Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can use that function to post your questions to any of the panelists or even general questions. I now take the opportunity to introduce Leonard Wancheko. Are you there, Leonard?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Leonard is principal investigator for the RISE program in Nigeria, and he's a professor of politics and associated faculty in economics at Princeton University in the United States. He's also the founder of the African School of Economics that is headquartered in Benin. So building, actually complementing on the presentation by Marla, Leonard is going to focus on the particular misalignments between politicians and communities and how he's helping to address them in Nigeria through holding summits that produce concrete social contracts around education. You're most welcome, Leonard.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. The slide. Thank you. So for the next 5 to 10 minutes, I will present a model of how you can socially engineer alignments. You know, alignment of interests between communities and politicians, alignment of policy. You know, for instance, the last presentation talked about misalignment between, for instance, textbooks and curriculum. You know, how do you actually achieve that? And also alignment of investment. You know, for instance, when investment is made, either by international communities or governments and local or national, how do you make those investments align and consistent with what parents are doing and other community members are doing, you know? And what I'm going to present is based on ongoing project in Nigeria. So, okay, so let me go to the next slide. Okay, good. All right, so the question, before I go to the question, so what we want to do is to see how constructive dialogues between education stakeholders, parents, teachers, will influence education outcome, education investment, learning outcome, and support, for education outcome, in Nigeria. So the intervention that we implemented have 3 components. One component is information gathering and dissemination on policy preferences. And then the second one is deliberation, like public deliberation, through the organization of what we call education summits. And then the third component is drafting and signing of an implicit social contract between key stakeholders. We want to see how the combination of these 3 components, this institution, affect learning outcome. So, so the research question is, as I said earlier, so how education policy, school management, how the intervention that I just mentioned, how it affects policies, management, teachers' quality, parental investment, and also learning outcome. So the intervention is a process of decision-making that have those three components. You want to see how this process affect policy, affect the way the school is managed, affect teachers' quality, parental investment, and then ultimately learning outcome. Now, what is also interesting about this is to explore the mechanism of this effect. So is the process I just described effective because of transparency, information, the fact that the policy that is designed is better informed, if you will? Or is it also because empowerment and coordination? You know, so alignments or misalignments, or alignment, I should say, is driven by the ability to coordinate between different stakeholders, and also the sense of empowerment and ownership that they have in the outcome of the process. Okay, so and then does this work also because of accountability? You know, because since we have a social contract, we want to see the extent to which the deliberation process makes the governor and the politician in general feel that they are being basically watched. They have made specific promises. They have committed to an outcome, and they will be judged based on that. And at the same time, like teachers and parents will be also be held accountable as a result of the fact that they were in the room when the decision were made, when the contract was signed. You know, so again, the contract is not, you know, like formal contract. It's not enforceable by law, but it's implicit. And I think that in itself, in fact, can be perhaps enough, you know, to achieve better outcome. And then we want to see, for instance, the extent to the heterogeneity of this effect. Okay, so there are three key aspects. So first, we have data collection, and you know, and we have the policy dialogue that I just described, the summit, and then the post-summit monitoring will consist of tracking various indicators and see how the process affected outcome. So the data we collected are, you know, come from like based on access, quality, financial management, teacher training. We also have, you know, several indicators in terms of like infrastructure, for instance, and evaluation of students. And so for the summit look like this. So, you know, as you can see from these pictures, we have, you know, we have presentations of the finding of the data, and then we have a moderator basically debating with the participants about the information that is provided, and then you know, some kind of discussions that this is lasted, you know, the whole day. And you know, from the discussion, you know, there is a video that I would like to show you very briefly, but this is what, you know, the summit looked like. It's very lively, very engaged, and you know, the governors the governor's representative were there, and you know, that's the governor's representative, and you know, anyway, so it was a really exciting event. So after this, there was a social contract that was signed, and a work plan followed, you know, and you can see, particularly from the work plan, the extent to which the government representative integrated the concern, not only the data, the evidence that was provided, but also the discussions and you know, that followed basically this. And now, you know, we are in the stage of actually the implementation of the work plan. And you can see not only how the government reacted very, very quickly, but also how the community as large, and teachers and parents and so on feel like they are really they took ownership of the process. So so later on, we are going to collect data to track the implementation, to see the improvement, and measure change in learning. So the main point here is that not only we have to sort of describe misalignment, we have to think creatively about how you socially engineered alignment. What kind of process you can put in place to minimize misalignment, and do it in such a way that you empower, that you get the community to take ownership of the process. So and I'm going to finish by saying that the idea behind this process, this project, the summit, it's something that mimic what is African culture in many West African countries, where communities get together and organize to be able to take ownership of school. So it's something that we need to really integrate into some of the research projects that we are doing, so that it's not just about what we want to do, but how we need to do it. How do we engineer socially what we want to accomplish? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leonard. Very beautiful. So I think the question here to ask ourselves, our systems, how are they coordinating the different stakeholders to ensure that everyone is aligned to delivering learning outcomes? How do we mobilize the communities to ensure that they are also owning the learning of their children and driving learning? So thanks a lot for that. Please keep the questions coming in the Q&A. Look at your screen at the bottom and keep them coming. Let me now take the opportunity to invite Vinci Davis. Vinci, are you there?
Hi, Goretti, I'm here.
Thank you. So Vinci Davis works with the Indian School of Public Policy. So her presentation looks at how bureaucratic culture processes are often more aligned with input-based goals rather than learning goals, and how recent reforms in Delhi we are able to incrementally shift the bureaucracy away from monitoring and toward motivating and supporting teachers. So it's going to the zone, how do we support the teachers to ensure that they deliver on learning? Over to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Goretti. So prior to joining the Indian School of Public Policy, I was with the Center for Policy Research, which is where this study took place. And I was working with Yamini Iyer, and the key question that we set out to ask was, how do we get states to embed reforms? What does it take, and how do we get from point A, after having a good plan in place, what will it take for us to get it embedded over a long period of time? So the study that we did was, this was an ethnographic study. It started in June 2016, ended in 2019. And we were studying a statewide initiative called Chunauti. And Chunauti, the word translates to challenge in Hindi. And this was a key teaching at the right level intervention, and it became the centerpiece of the state government, around which they planned a host of quality improvement interventions. Now, the story of Delhi becomes interesting because it had all these elements that we know that make programs successful. Political will was aplenty, and it was consistent throughout. We had this statewide program called Chunauti, where students from grades 6 to 9 were grouped according to their abilities in reading, writing, and math. And teachers had the freedom to come up with the interventions that would help them achieve curriculum level and foundational level expectations. Now, these programs were supported by a host of other interventions. And there were all these successful short-term campaigns that were dedicated to improving reading and writing, and teachers could visibly see the student progress in those interventions. Then there were all these workshops that were conducted that were different to the regular trainings that teachers were familiar with, that were more orientations and lecture-based. Then there were resource persons, dedicated resource persons, who helped develop pedagogic skills and create a culture of discussion around teaching and learning inside schools in an attempt to shift teacher focus from exams or teaching to the test. Or, as Marla also mentioned, the systems were aligned to ensure that students scored maximum in their exams. So the idea of these dedicated resource persons was to come in and shift that conversation inside schools. So you can see then there were all these other interventions, more parent-teacher interactions. The government came out of it, went out of its way to also conduct all sorts of felicitations for teachers to boost their morale and tell them that they had the freedom, that that teachers should not be tied to the syllabus and curriculum, that they should make sure that they're teaching in a way that students really understand the lessons. Right? So everything was in place and running alongside regular school activities. Yet we saw there was a lot of hesitation, especially in the beginning of the program, to embrace it in spirit. And this is despite the teachers seeing some immediate results, especially through those short-term reading campaigns. So what we discovered and what the focus of my presentation is, there is a core reason why this was the case. And one of the main reasons is the bureaucratic structure itself in which the schools are embedded. Now, if you look at this figure, you'll see the Department of Education, the State Department, it's rather top heavy. It's got anywhere between 14 to 20 branches, depending on the definitions you're following. And each of these branches speak to the schools either directly through something called circulars or office memos, which are sent every day. And schools don't start their routine without going through these circulars first and figuring out their day's priorities. Right? Or they go through the state's face at the intermediate level, which in our case is someone called the Deputy Director Education or the DDE, who's seated at the district level. Now, this individual, even though they're a principal, most often they're a principal promoted to this position, the position itself is purely administrative. And the DD becomes very important because he's the person that schools tend to go to for troubleshooting, for any kind of guidance. They're the ones who are assessing the schools and principals. And so they become important actors in their story. Now, the nature of the bureaucracy that we're talking about here is a classic Weberian one. It's top-down, hierarchical. It follows its own language. There's a certain bureaucracies that's followed, which is quite directive and punitive in nature. So that's the system and ecosystem in which schools are operating and in which these new programs were introduced. So it's unsurprising to see how school actors would be affected by the culture and the actors that shape their day-to-day agenda. So I'm going to show you 3 snippets from some interactions I've had with either teachers or principals. And you can see that, so this snippet is from a discussion where a principal was recalling a meeting that she had with a state level bureaucrat. This happened in late November, early December in 2016, soon after the successful reading campaign in October. It concluded in November, and this was soon after that. And this interaction with the bureaucrat happened around the time when exam become important again. Annual exams are around the corner. 10th and 12th grades are quite important as the marks that the schools score end up becoming the criteria against which schools are assessed. So this principal is recalling this meeting and she's saying how the state level bureaucrat told her and the other principals who were present at the meeting to stop paying attention to the program itself. That was well and good, but stop it in its track and start focusing on the 10th and 12th results. And she's commenting on how she found it quite disheartening. They had focused so much on the program and now all of a sudden they were being told to stop. So this mixed message was something that schools had to live with because schools on one end were given the instructions to follow certain programs, implement certain programs that was being pushed by a political top, but being filtered through the bureaucracy, they were getting mixed messages. But if the bureaucracy is accounted for in making plans in a way that they're aligned with the program and its intent, then the bureaucracy can become a catalyst of change as well. So, and there were efforts made to at least sporadically try to align especially the mid-level bureaucracy with the interventions. One of the key things that the state did to make sure mentor teachers, who was this cadre, the cadre that was created to make sure that teachers were focusing on pedagogy inside schools, they ended up making DDEs as their reporting authority. And that becomes important because then mentor teachers would get taken seriously inside schools. So this is an interaction between the mentor teacher and a DDE who's saying that there's an incident that's happened in the school, this is what keeps happening, and the mentor teacher can't say anything to the principal, but if you could have a word with him, it would make all the difference, and the DDE delivered on that, right? So just the word of the DDE alone can really shape priorities inside schools, and all of a sudden we're moving the ball on the program itself. Now, earlier I mentioned how critical circulars can be to schools. These reach schools through there's an official education portal which schools access every day. And we were tracking these. We had a database of around 8,000 circulars, of which we analyzed around 2,000, just to look at the language and tone of these documents. And when you look at these circulars, you repeatedly see the words directed to, or action taken, or strictly comply, or there's a lot of talk about penalties if data requirements aren't met. Right? So this is the language of the circulars in general. So again, it's unsurprising to see schools spending an inordinate amount of time trying to decipher what's going into these circulars, despite being told by the state on one hand that they had the freedom to get creative, at least with the learning interventions, right? So this is one anecdote where a teacher is saying that the school staff ended up debating over 3 hours of whether a certain circular around Chunauti meant to say the word and or. So what are my key takeaways here? Bureaucrats, especially the mid-level bureaucrats, are often forgotten actors, or they're treated as incidental to reform programs. But without aligning their interests and workflows with anything that's being planned, embedding a new program will be virtually impossible, only because of how critical their voice is to schools. Second, while the program itself might be coherent and internally sound, it's interacting with the system where the existing organizational culture and norms are such that hierarchy, strict top-down communication, a culture of passivity and victimhood always dominates. And by victimhood, I mean everyone up and down the chain of command in the state feels like they're a victim of the state. Right? So then again, we will struggle to push forward as the system always tries to default to the status quo. Finally, we want to consider the means through which the state communicates to itself that it wants to change for the better. So circulars, trainings, meetings, these are all the standard instruments that schools are used to. And schools understand the norms that they must follow when they're complying. And I want to use the word complying. With that is it's spelled out in these circulars or at these meetings. So when the political head and the bureaucracy is asking schools to change its substantive practices, we want to consider at the end of the day how this comes across to schools when you're relying on these standard instruments that schools have a certain history with. So that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Vinci. Thank you. So I guess we all have bureaucracies in our system. Maybe bureaucracies are not all that bad, as long as they are aligned to delivering learning goals instead of input-based goals. So thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to invite and introduce Julius Athura. Julius Athura is a postdoctoral research fellow at the International Christian University in Japan. Formerly, my former colleague, he led the curriculum effectiveness work strand at Paweza, East Africa. So building on the previous presentations and complementing them, Julius is going to present on the misalignments between the 3 instructional components of curriculum standards, classroom instruction, and assessment or examinations in primary schools. He draws examples from the work that was done in Tanzania and Uganda to exemplify how misalignment can be detected in the system. So Julius, over to you.
Thank you very much, Goretti, and everyone on this webinar. I'm really happy to present our joint work with Michelle Kaffenberger from RISE, entitled System Incoherence, Quantifying the Alignment of Primary Education Curriculum Standards, Examinations and Instruction in 2 East African countries. So the data, as Goretti has emphasized, comes from the curriculum effectiveness analysis stream of work that Paweza pioneered in East Africa. Paweza is a regional civil society organization operating in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And the focus here is on primary level literacy and numeracy. Okay, so I'll just go back. Our analysis cover 3 educational system component parts that lie at the heart of the learning process. That is curriculum design, classroom instruction, and learning assessments. We use the triangle of relationships shown here to illustrate the need for alignment along each of these sides, A, B, and C. So going back to one of Goretti's emphasized points earlier on the need to address the root causes of the learning crisis and to recognize that there are other forms of alignment, such as the ones that Leonard and Vinci Davis have just explained. However, we highlight the need to also focus on improving alignment along each of these sides of this particular triangle and these particular core component parts of the education system in efforts to address the root causes of the learning crisis. Reflecting back on the diagnostic framework that Mala presented, she explained coherence within a column, for example, the management relationship, and across roles, for example, the delegation relationship. So I will illustrate with an example from Uganda using the management relationship. So from 2007, Uganda reformed its primary level curriculum and introduced the thematic curriculum, which in principle asked teachers and schools to move away from teacher-centered instruction to making or putting the learner at the center of their learning. In other words, learner-centered pedagogy, which you would say is a demand which is aligned for learning. But when it came now to delivering the curriculum, first of all, the kind of support that was given to schools and teachers, and this is really not just a Ugandan case, there are many other examples as the work of Chishom and Leendeka shows in many countries of sub-Saharan Africa where curriculum reforms have happened. At the time now of rolling out the curriculum, teachers, a few teachers were collected and brought to central places and oriented on the new curriculum or the reformed curriculum and asked to go back and act as trainers of fellow teachers or other teachers. And then the curriculum was rolled out. Now, this particular kind of support, you'd say, is not really aligned for learning. It's aligned for something else. The result is definitely the teachers and the schools had to adopt the new curriculum. Absolutely, this is a policy decision. However, they delivered it using the old pedagogies of teacher-centered kind of instruction. So in the end, then the goal is not achieved. So we utilize the surveys of enacted curriculum approach to diagnose system, education system alignment issues. This approach has had wide application in the developed country settings, specifically here in the United States, and that is with the K-12 education system. But as I mentioned earlier, in the developing world, this methodology is still new, and Taweza pioneered introducing these methodologies in East Africa. So essentially, these are tools that are designed to collect, analyze, and report education content that is embedded in the instructional components that are being used to pursue learning. In our case, we are focusing on the three: the curriculum standards, the instruction that happens in the classroom, and the national assessments or the learning assessments at the end. The main output are learning alignment indices. So these methodologies give you an index that ranges between 0 and 1, 0 being completely no alignment between the two components that you are comparing, and then 1 showing perfect alignment between the two. In practice, we take 0.5 as acceptable alignment as a threshold measure. So I'll now illustrate with 2 examples of the results that we have in the main paper, and the paper, I'm gladly informed, has been shared. So primary English in Uganda. So these are three panels that you see here. On the left, these panels show the content that is embedded in the instructional components that we're analyzing. On the left-hand side, we're analyzing the curriculum standards or the syllabus standards. This is the content embedded in the primary English in Uganda, aggregated from primary 1 to primary 7. In the middle, we have the content or the content that was reported by teachers as delivered in the classroom. And for Uganda's case, we had only grade 3 and grade 5 teachers. And on the extreme right, we have the content that is embedded in the national exams. These are end of cycle national exams that were done in 2013, from 2013 to 2015. This is aggregated data. Now, these are 3D content maps. On the y-axis, you have the topics. You can call them what the students should know. And then on the x-axis are the the expectations for students to perform, or you can say what they should be able to do with this content. And then the third dimension reflected in these color bands refers to the amount of emphasis at every intersection that we are looking at. So to the extent to which the panels are not looking similar speaks to the amount of disalignment or misalignment. So when we compare the standards with the exams, we see that the alignment measure is 0.36. And when we compare the standards to what the teachers were doing in the classroom, we have an alignment measure of 0.34. As already said, we can't compare teachers to the exams here because we don't have all the teachers. But in Uganda's case, in Tanzania's case, for primary mathematics, we can compare, and we see that the alignment measure there is also still below the threshold. This is 0.33. So in summary, these are all the measures that we have in the analysis or in the paper. And for the 10 different measures or alignment measures that we make, only on two occasions do we see alignment measures that are above the threshold measure of 0.5. So what is the takeaway? The main takeaways here are three. One, that the alignment measures are low across the components, and this is true for the two countries that we are looking at in this case. We also see that teachers tend to cover broad strips of content and cognitive demand levels, which is not really well aligned with what the intention of the curriculum is or what the examinations are showing as the content they are focusing on. And thirdly, national exams are internally well aligned. Across years, the exams are internally very well aligned. However, they tend to over or underemphasize certain content areas, which decreases the alignment with the curriculum standards. And a final point to make here relates to the surveys of enacted curriculum tools. So these tools offer a positive diagnosis of what the coverage does look like. So they spell out the lay of the land. They are not really, they don't take a normative stance as in to state how the content or the coverage should look like. So these are tools that are important for experts to use to inform educational content reforms and also teacher support initiatives. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julius, for beautifully demonstrating the use of the SEC, supposedly enacted curriculum, to actually try and detect how our curricula or our system is aligned for the standards, teaching, and the assessment. So thank you very, very much. Let me now take the opportunity to invite our last panelist, George Di Stefano, if you're there. So, Di Stefano is leading RTI's. RTI stands for Research Triangle International. He leads RTI's work on supporting education system reforms related to the policies, strategies, and management capacities necessary to improve learning outcomes on a large scale. So Joe is going to help us to tie together all the previous 4 presentations and try to draw connections between the different approaches that they have presented on addressing systems alignments and try to drive the point home. So Joe, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Goretti, and thanks to RISE for organizing this interesting collection of panels, and to the colleagues for making their concise but pointed presentations. And I think that the information we've been able to share during this webinar really highlights the main point that Goretti was driving home at the beginning, which is the theme of the webinar, that more resources, while necessary by themselves, will not lead to the learning outcomes we all want to see education systems achieve, unless there is the kind of alignment that we now have some very tangible examples of what we're speaking about, and that's what I want to speak to. I do love Goretti's analogy of the car without aligned wheels. I think we've all had that experience of seeing a car coming down the road where the wheels seem to be pointing a different direction than the car is driving. And the reaction we all have is that, oh my God, something bad may be about to happen. And I think that analogy is really pointed in terms of the crisis that education systems were facing before the pandemic in terms of not producing the kind of learning outcomes we'd like to see. And that certainly has all been exacerbated by the interruptions to schooling caused by the pandemic. And the systems that were weak beforehand and that were not serving marginalized populations very well, certainly because of the pandemic are weakened and with increased amounts of marginalization. And if 90% of children of 10-year-olds aren't learning basic foundational skills, then it's not really marginalization, it's the majority of students who are not being served. And so trying to address that, I think the issues of alignment, the RISE framework speaks to the specific ways in which a priority on learning, which I think the last 10 years we've been able to globally sort of raise the issue of learning needing to be a priority and that systems need to be producing better learning outcomes. But the RISE framework provides a way to think about how that priority actually gets translated into action in the sort of bureaucratic systems that manage education around the world. And so the ideas of delegation, finance, support, information, and motivation are those mechanisms. And it's whether or not those mechanisms are aligned that determine whether the system can translate its priority into action at the classroom level. What I really like about the surveys of an enacted curriculum and the work that Julius and others are doing around that is that it really shows what that looks like at the classroom level. And the idea that even if the standards are well designed and well developed, and even if exams are aligned to those standards more or less, as some of the data that Julius was sharing show, unless teachers are actually teaching the curriculum and delivering it in the way as intended, then you have the increasing levels of misalignment. And so the challenge of getting the teachers to do what's necessary to actually align their instruction and adjust their pedagogy to reflect the kinds of learning we wish to see happening among children in their classrooms, that throws off the entire objective of improving learning. And so then what is it, how does that system, what's required to translate down the system all the way to the classroom, to each teacher in front of his or her set of students? And so that I think the example that Vinci shared from Delhi really points to this important middle level of the system where that transformation or that translation actually occurs. And so whether the instruments of the bureaucracy are able to communicate and reinforce effectively what the priority is and what the changes are that are required in terms of instructional behavior, in terms of support behaviors for teachers, and in terms of the behaviors of the system in general, that's a critical aspect. And I think research we've been doing at RTI on effective programs that have supported large-scale improvements in learning, that we also focus on this critical decentralized level, the part of the system that most directly interacts with schools, right? So that if that is not aligned to what it is we're expecting schools to do, then you can see how that throws off the objectives. And so I really like the idea of how the language of the bureaucracy, the mechanisms of the bureaucracy are what transmit the cultural, the organizational culture and the norms that Vinci was referring to. And that if we want to begin to change that, we have to really focus on those aspects as well. And it's not a short-term fix per se. It is going to take a long time to shift the organizational culture and the norms within education bureaucracies. But it is something that is a critical piece of the puzzle that we need to be working on. And I think the example that Leonard shared really highlights some of the ways that can be done, right? He refers to the sort of social engineering of alignment. I really like that idea, Leonard. I think it explicitly recognizes that there's an entire political economy that's around us. It's not just a bureaucratic or a management challenge, it's a broader challenge. And that the other actors who are also part of the system, parents, families, local stakeholders, also need to be involved and engaged in understanding what it is we're trying to align to. And I really like the idea of taking what we understand within organized societies to be an implicit social contract and making it explicit, an actual enforceable contract that everyone understands then what the priorities are, what the objectives are, what the actions are that need to be taken. So I think as a whole, this set of presentations really gives us a way to understand how we move from setting a priority to actually seeing it translate down the education system and lead to instructional improvements and changes that actually will help children learn and will begin to be the part of the solution to the learning crisis. And with that, I turn it back to you, Goretti.
Thank you very much, Joe, for pulling this all together, really driving the point and re-emphasizing it, that if we want learning to happen for all children, then learning has to be a priority. All systems have to be moving into that direction. So we now have a couple of minutes for questions and answers. So we thank you very, very much, all of you who have taken time to post some questions in the chat. And please, you can keep them coming all the same. We will take, first of all, about 3 questions. We get a couple of some more time, we shall address other questions. Panelists, there's a question here from Idalia Rodriguez, who is asking, systems thinking is critical, but changing the key relationships can take a long time. True. Which parts of the system or subsystems should we prioritize and try to change fast? In particular, what parts of the system can we change quickly to address COVID? Looks like we need some quick answers here. Any panelists who wants to go first on that one? You can unmute yourselves.
Already, if others are hesitant, I'd be happy to. But Leonard, it looks like you turned off your mute. If you want to speak, go ahead.
Yeah. No, so no, maybe just quickly to say that this is why institutions are important, because the process that we put in place, we're trying to put in place in Nigeria, for instance, it's something that can get tangible results in terms of changing behavior. We've been one electoral cycle, because instead of waiting for the information to be shared, waiting for actors to position themselves, you just put everybody in the same room and say, okay, here are the rule of engagement, here are the problems. Let's do something. Let's sign a contract and let's make sure that we are on the same page, and and we have a couple of months or a couple of years to see results. So what I'm saying is that it's really, the question highlights the need to think creatively about institutions at the community level, at the state level, at the school level, to make the process more effective and more efficient, and also less less time consuming, because anyway, so I think this is what my reaction to that really interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Aligning all the systems, sorry.
Yeah.
The stakeholders.
Yes.
True. Okay. So thank you very much. Any other panelists who wanted to respond to the same question?
Already, maybe I would just come in with
Yeah.
what's maybe the classic annoying economist response, and to say that I think it depends to some extent on the system that you're thinking about intervening in. And I think that that is one of the sort of main messages of this diagnostic framework is, and one of the key things that you said in your opening remarks, there are no silver bullets. Well, part of that is just common sense, but also part of it is that every system is different and every system needs different things. And even in responding to COVID, systems are starting from different places. And so the first step that you should take to recover is going to look different in different places. Now, that being said, one of the things that COVID has done, and what Joe was mentioning in his discussant remarks, is across like all social systems, COVID has revealed a lot of the things that were broken before COVID, and COVID just like exacerbated how broken they were. And in the case of education systems, I think one of those was the overambitiousness of the curriculum, and how many children fall behind every year because they just can't keep up, and then the curriculum moves ahead without them. And the big concern, as schools reopen, is how much learning have children lost, and how far behind have they fallen, and will they continue to fall if schools just reopen and carry on business as usual, the curriculum as usual. And I think the way that the curriculum as usual was serving students or not serving them is really highlighted in Julius and Michelle's research. So I think one of the areas to look at, in addition to what Leonard was mentioning in terms of responding to COVID and thinking about reopening, is what are the lessons going to be, what's going to be prioritized in terms of instruction when schools do reopen, so that the losses in learning that children have had, in this time that they've been out of school, aren't compounded by sort of trying to move too quickly when they are able to return.
Yeah, if I could just add one quick thing to that, and Marla, thank you, and Leonard as well. I think a succinct answer is that the instructional core is what matters, and thinking about what does the system do to change that instructional core. And there are lots of really great programs that are out there that are introducing improved instructional methods, improved materials, et cetera. But where it really falls down is whether the system is providing the support that's needed to actually take it up and implement it on a day-to-day basis. And so the thing I would say to focus on is the instructional core, but the system supports that are needed for that to be systematically implemented. And because that's where most interventions fail.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. So we have a second question here that goes to the panelists to address. A question from Stephen Cleese. By aligning the system to learning, do we risk narrowing or ignoring the other broader purposes of education? Is there room for other important goals, e.g., or for example, moral education? Are we narrowly focused on learning in our strategies that we are proposing? Anyone wants to go for that? Just unmute and respond.
If I may.
Yes,
sorry, Julius. Yeah. I understand where your concern is coming from, but considering systems, is, at least in the context of India, public education systems tend to focus on so many things outside of core teaching and learning. They tend to lose focus on the whole point of having schools in the first place, right? So there are lots of social services that are being imparted through schools. They become the go-to site for various departments to sort of filter their services through. So in that context, coming up with an agenda that clearly focuses on teaching, learning, and learning outcomes becomes important, only because there's a recognition that schools must do many other things also. It's not to say that schools will no longer provide social justice schemes or other kinds of benefits that students are getting. But the point is, because there's so many, their attention is diverted in so many directions, there's a need to sort of make sure that we're speaking in unison when it comes to teaching learning outcomes, in short.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to build on, so thank you, Vince Davis. Just building on your point, I actually don't see these two as being mutually exclusive. I think learning unless we narrow the definition, and really the way we are approaching this discussion is not in a narrow sense, but I think learning embodies all those aspects that this question is really referring to. But also it's important to emphasize again the point that Mala spoke about of the overambitiousness of education. So if we want to get everything or get children to pick everything in a very short period of time, then that in the end defeats everything. So it's like you cannot hit everything at the same time. So my main point is that really there's no mutual exclusion between these 2 points.
Yeah, thank you. Very well put. More education is also part of learning, right? It depends on how you define learning. So we have a couple of questions. I'll quickly move you to other sets of questions. We have a question here from Gilbert B. Girencha. He's asking, when thinking at the scale of the system, how do we balance interventions for all children versus focusing on specific groups, that is supporting children with disabilities? How do we ensure that the system works not only for some types of children, but for all groups, including those with disabilities? Anyone wants to go for this?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and say this is a very important question, and so you know, and I think it's something that cannot just be resolved at the school level. It has to be, you know, it has to be resolved at the state level, at the government level, and you know, NGOs, especially one on children's rights, are very important. So to come back to you know, my own presentation, for instance, this is some of the issues that came up during the meeting, and then it was explicitly included in the so-called social contract. You know, so to complement what had been said earlier, so I think learning outcome is important, but how to achieve it and how to get everybody on the same page, you know, to align interests, energy, investment, you know, I think this is all important. And those are things that should be measured. You know, I mean, even if your learning outcome doesn't come right away, if the foundational, you know, the foundational aspect of learning, you know, which has to do with management, with aspirations, with parental investment, all this kind of stuff, we bring together, you know, learning is going to come, you know, in the near or not so far ahead, you know. Anyway, so I think this is what I would like to add to the earlier discussion and then this question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard. Thanks.
Anyone want to have a 2 cents on that?
Yes, Joe. Julius, rather. Julio.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is the really very big point that for which we are in this webinar, really. The issue of inclusion is so important. And just to say that inclusion is not just about the example that is highlighted in this question is about children with disability or children with special needs. But now inclusion really, you have to look at many aspects, including socioeconomic status. We know that socioeconomic status is such a huge determinant of what kind of learning happens and is achieved by the children. And focusing on the presentation that I made, this is a big issue in that we have evidence that shows that curricular reforms usually ignore the majority of the children that usually belong to the socially poor, and therefore the curricula are really targeting children at the top of the learning distribution. So I think we can't overemphasize how important this is and the fact that this is really broad. It's a key point that we must focus on.
Yeah. I mean, in this discussion, it's quite easy sometimes to forget that there are these special groups. And I think Gilbert also raised this because quite often other excluded groups like the socioeconomic status issues normally emphasized at the expense of the children with special needs. So it's very good that this is brought into the discussion. So thank you very much. May I actually request all the panelists to put on their videos so that we have this interactive discussion and so that I'm able to see you. Please go ahead, put on your videos.
Could I come in to reiterate one point Julius made, and maybe on that last point, and just to say, I think this was sort of implied in what you were saying, Julius, but maybe not coming out as strongly as it should. When you say that the curriculum reforms that you're talking about are oriented at elite children, and they're actually leaving most children behind. And so when we talk about inclusion of the system, you know, if the average child isn't learning anything, or is learning very little in every additional year that they spend in school, then focusing on the bottom child, the worst off child, well, the worst off child and the average child are both not learning very much. And so that really emphasizes the need for overall systems change. It's not just the most marginalized children who aren't getting what they need out of school. It's even the average or the median child who isn't getting what they need out of school. And I think that it's easy for us to lose track of that because we do want to focus on marginalization, but in systems that aren't really working for most kids, many kids are being marginalized, many kids are being left out. And I think I don't want us to lose track of that point that Julius was making about what inclusion even means in this context.
Yeah, you're very right, Mala. I mean, if you have 90% of children, 10-year-olds, who are not able to read and understand, almost the system is leaving everyone behind. So you're very, very right. So we have a couple of other questions here. There's a question which has been raised by a number of participants. Just to summarize it, so what are ways to empower weaker actors in the system, like rural communities, where mediators in Ledadi's research project in Enugu state able to change the power dynamics? This is specifically mainly addressed to you, Ledad.
Yeah, so yeah, I think those are great questions. So the way we dealt with these issues is, first of all, the survey was very representative, and the pre-summit was very inclusive, not only in terms of data collection, but in terms of engagements with different, not different actors and stuff. But okay, but at the summit itself, those who came, it was not just like, the political elite. We were representing their various communities, like teachers and parents, community leaders, traditional rulers and stuff. And all these were involved. Okay, but after that, after the summit, something that we are planning to do is actually to disseminate and to engage the population more widely about what had been said, what had been discussed, with the possibility that they actually take ownership, amend and take ownership of what had been said. Basically, the priority, the social contract, they were framework. They were just the first stage of something that should be going on for a long time, for us to keep learning about what the issues are, how to address them, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I think it's a very, very important question, and it calls to the pre-summit, which has to be inclusive, which has to be as engaging as possible, but also the post-summit, where you need to inform the population at large, the community at large, not only to improve on what had been said, but also for people to join forces, to take action, and also to hold the leadership accountable. So that's how that's how we think about the engagement of the population at large.
Thank you very much. I guess also to do that, you need a number of stakeholders to try and pull these communities together, including
Exactly.
Thanks very much, Leonard. So let me push you to another question from a participant, our colleague, Leah Skoyo, is asking, given the importance of context on teaching and learning, how transferable are the tools for aligning the components of education systems across country contexts? Very important. And wants to go to this? How do we align?
Gorete, can I briefly?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, just so briefly to talk about to use the example of the surveys of enacted curriculum tools. So I already emphasized in the presentation that as of now, these tools have really had broad application in developed country settings, and they are just being rolled out. We are still pioneering in the developing country settings. But our experience in East Africa shows that the tools can be contextualized and be made to fit the context of specific countries, like the countries in East Africa. And right now, RISE is seeking to take these tools to other contexts of developing countries so that we see what kind of results come from those different contexts and then compare them for developing country application. And that's what I can say for the SECs.
So, thank you. So it's possible to actually contextualize these tools. So you choose the aspect that works for you. Yeah. Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, about 4 minutes to close the question and answer. And I think we can at least tackle at least 2 questions. We have a question here from Nitika Polani. How do the information and data used by the system shape what the system focuses on? She's mainly focusing, addressing this to Vince's work in India, where is set their priorities for schools, or in Julius's work on exams. So the question here is, how do the information and data used by the system shape?
Yeah, the question made me smile, only because it presupposes that people are using data for a reason to begin with. The problem that we face with the general Indian bureaucracy is that apart from doing substantive work in order to, I don't know, I mean, there's a concept in sociology called institutional isomorphism, okay, which comes to my mind, which is that if we can't do substantive work done, we can't get substantive work done or lead to any outcomes, we just end up doing these thin activities like data collection. Right? So in terms of data sources that DDs rely on, they rely on the same information that schools get. They also have access to the education portal, and they also receive the circulars. But DDs, poor people, they have to do way more things than schools have to, that cut across schemes, departments, private schools, and all sorts of things. So when you say they're using information to set priorities for schools, schools set it on their own based on the circulars they're receiving, but the DD can always override this based on the data requirement that they might have. So often we will see, and we've been in that situation many times inside schools, when I'm talking to a principal and then they will suddenly show me their WhatsApp with the DD taking a picture of a format and some information that they require. So in that way, the most frequent way we've seen DD set that priority is to, in schools, is to override what schools were doing in the first place. And it's often something to do with data requirement. First part of your answer, to address your question. In terms of engaging with data for actually some useful purpose, right? So in the case of Chunauti, again, the state was collecting a lot of information about how students were progressing. And while DDs weren't trained, they were hauled up by the state, and we were part of certain meetings also where they were supposed to make presentations about how these districts were performing, and they had to analyze and explain why certain schools or certain parts were doing better than others. So that was done without the training, so that finesse was obviously missing in terms of the analysis, but an attempt was made. When it comes to education data that DDs most engage with, most frequently engage with, it is exam pass percentages and how well schools are doing. And that's where they tend to intervene. So they come in at strategic times, maybe towards the end of the year, right before the exams, And then they will get a bunch of information beforehand about how schools had performed in the previous years, and then ask principals why certain students aren't meeting the mark. Right? So that's their level of engagement. Right. So it's in terms of education data, it still comes down to pass percentages. This is in the routine. But when it came to Chunauti, they tried to engage with the progress that students were doing that was coming out in data, but it was rather sporadic. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of capacity building of bureaucrats in general when it comes to using data for any effective means.
Thanks. I think it's bringing on the table the important issue of using evidence and data. So how do you use that to actually drive the alignment of the system? So in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I would like us to go back to this question, which leads us back to our initial question. Money, we need the money. We need the money, but is it sufficient to drive learning? So the question here, which is coming from multiple audiences, it says, do you agree that it is difficult to change education systems with limited resources? What is the role of financing in achieving system level realignment? We need the money, do we? So here is a question to us as we wind up this panel. Anyone wants to go for it?
Goretti, I think it's a clear answer. Yes, we need the money. Financing is too important for education. And we can't overemphasize the fact that developing countries right now spend very, very little in terms of per child, in terms of spending on their education. But the question that actually informs this webinar is that enough? And the answer still, given the presentations we've made here, is that we need to learn better how to use even the little that is available. But yes, more money is needed. Very, very much so. I agree.
Thank you. We need more money to do more of the alignment. Any other one who wants to add on to that and maybe?
Sure.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I have just something quick to add, and Grady, I recall something that you said in your introductory remarks about this can no longer be business as usual. And if the bulk of financing of education systems are what we could call routine expenditures, then clearly what is done with those expenditures, and they do need to increase, but what is done with them is what matters. So we can't continue to just fund the routine if we're admitting that business as usual is not going to solve the learning crisis. So that, for me, is the crux of the issue.
Yeah, and then I will agree entirely with the colleagues, and add that it shows that management matters, accountability, transparency matters, and also mobilizing resources, the process of mobilizing resources from the community as well matters, so it cannot just be a process where money comes from elsewhere, drop onto the school. There might be ways of generating the resources and so on. So all this together matters, for outcome.
Thank you very much. One last? Okay. Otherwise, I think as we move towards the end of this very, very interesting and very, very interactive panel, let me take this opportunity to thank our panelists, but also all of you very, very active participants for the thought-provoking questions that you have raised to us. I think as we ended, yes, we need more money. We cannot do less, because some of the underperforming countries in terms of learning outcomes are also the same countries which spend less on education. So we need more resources. But as the panelists have really, really put it, it cannot be business as usual. You cannot just keep pumping money into a system that is not aligned to driving learning outcomes. And some of the strategies and approaches that we have gotten here, for example, the strategy that Mala, or the framework that Mala shared, which helps us to detect the misalignments in the system so that we are not treating symptoms, but we are actually treating the actual causes of not learning, of non-learning, is very important. But also, as Julius put it, we need to get all these three instructional components: the planned curriculum, the teaching and learning, and the assessment to actually be driving learning. If assessment is looking at something else, like most of our education systems are doing, then teaching and learning is going to be driven at just delivering that very, very constrained kind of learning. We want more learning and competencies and skills for the children. And also Vince talked about the issue of mid-level bureaucracies. We all have bureaucracies in our system, but how do we ensure that gradually, it might take time, we shift the focus of these bureaucracies from just measurable outcomes or input-based goals to ensure that they're actually geared at driving learning. And in doing this, we need everyone. We need everyone on board. Like we said at the beginning, it takes a village to educate a child. So we need all stakeholders. And I think the framework that that Leonard gave us from Nigeria of how do we ensure that we mobilize all stakeholders in the system, especially beginning with the communities, to ensure that they are all aligned to delivering learning is very important. And you need key stakeholders here, not only government, you need the academics, like we have seen here, you need civil society organizations, you need researchers, and many others. So really lastly, we want to drive the point here and say, and we really wish the very best to the world leaders who are convening next week in the UK and in collaboration with Kenya. We need the resources, but it cannot be business as usual. Let's look at all these other issues that can help us to drive learning so that we are not only pumping more resources into the system, but we're ensuring that those resources are moving into one direction, like our well-aligned car to deliver learning. So I really want to thank you very much. And in a special way, I thank RISE for bringing us together in this community of practice and on this platform to discuss these important matters ahead of the Global Education Summit happening next week. So thank you very much. We shall definitely be in touch with you in due course with, I guess, copies of the presentations and so on. So thank you very much for your time, and have a good evening or good morning or good afternoon. Thank you. Yes, we shall share the presentations. Please keep a look at your emails. Thank you very much for your very active participation, and very many thanks to our panelists for this engaging discussion. Have a very good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Bye-bye. Thank you.